1 minute ago, and for the purposes of this video, treat that as the moment this story broke. Iranian ballistic missiles struck Dimona, not a neighborhood in Tel Aviv, not a suburb of Jerusalem, not a military base in the Negev. Dimona, the facility that Israel has operated for more than 6 decades without ever officially confirming what it does. The facility that the International Atomic Energy Agency has never been permitted to inspect. The facility that every serious analyst of Middle East security has understood for 60 years to be the beating heart of Israel's undeclared nuclear weapons program. The explosion was visible from cities across the Negev, and the Israeli government has not issued a statement about what was struck inside the perimeter. It has not confirmed the nature of the damage. It has not told its civilian population whether what is now burning inside Dimona poses any risk to the air, the water, or the ground in the surrounding region. It has gone silent. And that silence is different from every other silence Israel has maintained in this conflict, because every other silence was about military failure. This silence is about something that has no precedent in the history of this war and no established playbook for how a government manages the public communication of what just happened. Understanding exactly what Dimona is, why striking it is categorically different from everything else Iran has done in this war, and what the silence of the Israeli government is telling you about what is actually happening inside that perimeter right now. That is what this video is going to give you. To understand why what happened this morning is different from everything that preceded it, you need to understand what Dimona actually is, and why Israel has spent 60 years refusing to officially acknowledge what everyone already knows. The Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center, located approximately 9 kilometers outside the city of Dimona, in the southern Israeli desert, was constructed with direct French technical and material assistance beginning in the late 1950s under Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. The construction was deliberately obscured from American intelligence at the time. When the Eisenhower administration discovered the facility's scope and scale, Ben-Gurion described it to the White House as a textile factory. The Americans accepted that explanation long enough for the facility to become operational. Israel has described Dimona publicly to every international body, every inspecting government, every journalist who has asked, as a research reactor used for peaceful scientific purposes. That description has been maintained with remarkable and deliberate consistency across every Israeli government for 6 decades, regardless of which political party was in power, what international pressures were applied, or what evidence was produced by outside analysts, foreign intelligence agencies, and former insiders. The reason for that consistency is not conviction. It is policy. The policy is called nuclear ambiguity, sometimes referred to as nuclear opacity. Israel neither confirms nor denies possessing nuclear weapons. It does not acknowledge Dimona's weapons-related activities. It does not permit IAEA inspections of the facility. It has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it has maintained this position as an official state doctrine for 6 decades because the policy serves a specific and coldly rational strategic purpose. Nuclear ambiguity allows Israel to possess the full deterrent effect of a nuclear capability without triggering the formal international non-proliferation responses that an explicit acknowledgement would produce. If Israel officially declared itself a nuclear state, it would face sanctions pressure, arms embargo demands, and international legal obligations under the NPT framework that its current ambiguity policy successfully avoids. The ambiguity allows the deterrent to function without the diplomatic costs of formal acknowledgement. Iranian missiles struck the facility this morning, and the ambiguity policy is now colliding with a physical reality that ambiguity cannot manage, because what is burning inside Dimona right now is not something that Israel can describe as a peaceful research reactor accident and expect the global audience watching this conflict to accept. The Israeli government's silence this morning is not the silence of a government that has nothing to say. It is the silence of a government that has no language available to describe what just happened, language that doesn't either confirm what Dimona contains or describe the damage in terms that make the ambiguity policy impossible to maintain. Think about the position that silence represents. Every word the Israeli government says about Dimona this morning is a word that either acknowledges the nuclear weapons infrastructure that decades of official policy have refused to confirm, or describes damage to a peaceful research facility in terms that cannot account for why the silence following a strike on a peaceful research facility is so complete and so prolonged. There is no statement available that threads that needle, so the government has chosen silence. And that silence is telling you more about what was hit this morning than any official statement could. Compare it to every previous silence in this conflict. When interceptor coverage over Tel Aviv was depleted to the point where the shelter instruction was no longer backed by a functioning protective system, the government didn't tell civilians because telling them was politically and operationally inconvenient. When warning timelines were shortened below the threshold the civil defense model required, the government didn't announce the degradation, because honest communication of that fact would have required acknowledging the defensive deterioration it was trying to manage quietly. This silence belongs to a different category. Those prior silences were about military failure, tactical, recoverable, the kind of thing a government can eventually explain after the fact without permanently altering the strategic picture. This silence is about the strategic foundation that 6 decades of Israeli security policy has been built on. When the government refuses to speak about what happened to that foundation this morning, it is not managing a news cycle. It is managing the possible end of a doctrine. Let's talk about the physical consequences, because this is the dimension of this story that the technical and scientific community is watching most carefully, and it deserves honest and careful explanation rather than either dismissal or amplification. The consequences of a strike on nuclear infrastructure vary enormously depending on what specifically is hit and what the operational status of the struck facility is at the time of the strike. A strike on a fully operational nuclear reactor actively generating heat through fission produces different consequences from a strike on a weapons storage facility or processing plant handling nuclear materials in a non-operational state. The Dimona facility is believed by analysts to include several distinct infrastructure components. A research reactor that has been operational at various points in the facility's history and is believed to have been the production source for the plutonium used in Israel's weapons program. Reprocessing facilities that separate weapons-grade plutonium from reactor fuel. Weapons assembly and storage infrastructure where finished nuclear devices are believed to be housed, and the supporting technical and administrative systems that keep the facility operational. What was struck inside the perimeter has not been confirmed. Israeli nuclear experts quoted by the Times of Israel stressed that Dimona houses a small research reactor, not a giant commercial power reactor, and that it is protected by both active and passive defense measures. Nissim Levy, one of those experts, stated that radiological damage from a strike would likely be very localized, structurally different from the Chernobyl disaster or Fukushima. The IAEA confirmed it detected no damage at the Negev Nuclear Research Center and no abnormal radiation levels in the vicinity. Iraq's Green Observatory, monitoring the region independently, ruled out a radiation leak, but explicitly warned that a direct hit on the reactor would trigger a cross-border environmental disaster, noting that Israel's containment protocols could limit but not eliminate wider contamination. So here is what the evidence currently supports. The missiles struck the towns of Dimona and Arad in close proximity to the facility. At least one missile struck a structure inside Dimona. At least 180 people were injured across both towns, including a 10-year-old boy in serious condition with shrapnel wounds. The facility itself, to the extent that can currently be verified, does not appear to have suffered confirmed direct reactor damage. The IAEA has detected no radiation anomaly. But that verification is operating through the same information environment that the Israeli government is actively managing. What the Israeli government knows about what was hit inside that perimeter, and is choosing not to share, is a different data set from what the IAEA can confirm through external monitoring. The most immediate and most urgent consequence of the Dimona strike for Israeli civilians is not the radiological risk that current evidence suggests is limited. It is the information gap itself. The communities surrounding Dimona, the city of Beersheba, the largest city in the Negev, Arad, and every town between them and the facility, have been told nothing about what to do. No evacuation, no shelter in place, no guidance to seal homes or avoid outdoor activity. The Israeli government knows exactly what is inside Dimona. It knows exactly what was hit. It knows exactly what the current status of the facility is. And it is not sharing that with the civilians living in its shadow. Here's the dimension of this story that most coverage is going to miss, because it requires stepping back from the immediate crisis and looking at what Iran has actually demonstrated strategically, not just tactically. Most analysis of the Dimona strike will frame it as Iran getting lucky, as a penetration of Israeli air defenses that produced an outcome Iran didn't necessarily plan for. That framing is wrong, and it is important to explain why it is wrong. Iran did not stumble into Dimona. It engineered the conditions under which Dimona became reachable. In the first 3 days of this conflict, Iran's opening strikes systematically targeted Israeli radar and early warning infrastructure. Those strikes were not about causing civilian casualties or military damage in the conventional sense. They were about degrading the sensor architecture that the multi-layer defense system depends on for effective intercept sequencing. The cluster warhead campaign that followed, which the IDF confirmed had reached 70% of incoming missiles by late March, was not primarily about the damage the submunitions caused on the ground. It was about forcing Israel's interceptor operators to make impossible choices, fire one interceptor at a single trackable missile and watch 20 submunitions reach their targets anyway, or attempt to engage submunitions individually and burn through a stockpile that took years to build in a matter of weeks. Every Tel Aviv strike drained that stockpile. Every Jerusalem strike drained it further. Every strike on a military facility, every salvo that forced Israel to fire arrow rounds at targets that could have been left to Iron Dome, was a step in a systematic depletion campaign that had a specific terminal destination. Iran struck Dimona after that campaign had run its course. The salvo that reached Dimona was calibrated to the specific defensive conditions that the preceding weeks of strikes had produced. Conditions that Iran engineered. That is not a lucky shot by an adversary that got through defenses it didn't expect to penetrate. That is the planned terminal phase of a campaign that was working toward Dimona from the beginning. And what Iran demonstrated in reaching Dimona is something that changes the threat calculus of every government on Earth with nuclear infrastructure, not just Israel. Iran demonstrated that ballistic missiles can reach and strike the most sensitive nuclear facility in the Middle East through a sophisticated layered air defense system that was specifically designed and resourced to protect that facility. The Arrow system, David's Sling, Patriot, and whatever specialized point defense assets were positioned around Dimona specifically were not sufficient. That demonstration is now permanent. The knowledge that it happened cannot be undone. Every nuclear power that has assumed its own facilities are protected by distance, by defense architecture, or by the deterrent assumption that striking nuclear infrastructure is a threshold no rational adversary would cross, is now watching Iran prove all three of those assumptions wrong simultaneously. Iran crossed that threshold against the most defended target in Israel, and it crossed it successfully. The American response to the Dimona strike is the most consequential single decision that Washington has faced since this conflict began, and it is being made right now. The Dimona strike is not just an attack on Israeli nuclear infrastructure. It is an attack on the assumptions that have governed American nuclear deterrence policy in the Middle East for 60 years. 3 specific assumptions failed this morning. The assumption that Israel's nuclear capability was secure from conventional attack, that the combination of geographic isolation, dedicated defense systems, and the deterrent environment created by American military backing made a strike on Dimona strategically irrational. The assumption that the ambiguity policy was sustainable because no adversary could realistically threaten the facility the policy was designed to protect. And the assumption that American military engagement in the theater, the $5.6 billion in munitions spent in the first 2 days of Operation Epic Fury, the THAAD battery, the carrier strike groups, the forward presence at Prince Sultan Air Base, created a deterrent ceiling that Iran would not breach. All 3 failed this morning. And the administration that has been managing its involvement within bounded escalation parameters is now facing pressure to respond to the Dimona strike in a way that the current state of American military capacity in the theater, depleted by 29 days of intensive operations, and the political will of an administration trying to keep this war bounded cannot easily accommodate. Pete Hegseth stated weeks ago that never in recorded history had a nation's military been so quickly and effectively neutralized. The IRGC patrol boat circling supertankers in the Strait of Hormuz at 5% throughput, the missiles still flying from Lebanon, the Houthi launch last week, and now Iranian ballistic missiles inside the Dimona perimeter. That statement has not aged well. The White House said Operation Epic Fury would take 4 to 6 weeks. It is now day 31 or beyond, depending on when you are watching this. Vice President Vance said it will continue a little while longer. The Dimona strike has now changed what a little while longer means, both for the American public and for every government watching this conflict from outside. The open question that the Dimona strike leaves hanging over this conflict, and over the entire global nuclear order, is the one that no government is prepared to answer publicly this morning. What does Iran do next with the capability it has now proven? It demonstrated it could reach Tel Aviv, then it demonstrated it could reach Jerusalem, then it demonstrated it could reach both simultaneously. Now it has demonstrated it can reach the most defended nuclear facility in the Middle East. Iran's statement after the Dimona area strike was unambiguous. No area is safe from Iranian missiles. The enemy must surrender before it is too late. The escalation ladder that produced those 4 demonstrations has one more rung that nobody wants to name out loud. And the silence of the Israeli government this morning, that complete, extended, policy-breaking silence from a government that has maintained a 60-year doctrine of strategic communication about this facility, is the most honest communication about how close to that rung this conflict has now arrived that any official source is going to provide. The paradox that Juan Cole and other analysts have noted is now fully exposed. Israel's secrecy preserved its deterrence for 60 years, but it also created a vulnerability. By refusing to acknowledge its arsenal, Israel avoided international scrutiny. But that same secrecy made Dimona a uniquely tempting target for an adversary seeking to expose Israel's vulnerabilities, because striking Dimona produces strategic damage that no Israeli statement can fully contain, regardless of whether the physical damage is limited or catastrophic. Iran has now collected that strategic dividend. The physical damage may be, as current evidence suggests, more limited than the worst-case scenarios, but the strategic damage to Israel's ambiguity doctrine, to American deterrence assumptions, to the calculus of every nuclear power watching, is not limited. It is not recoverable through a press statement, and it will not be undone by the next military escalation, whatever form that takes. The silence from Jerusalem is the clearest signal available about where this conflict now stands. A government speaks when it has something to say that serves its interests. When a government that has maintained a doctrine for 60 years